Previously on The Dark Side of Love, when actress Dominique Dunne is brutally strangled to death in 1982 by her ex-boyfriend, Thomas Sweeney, her friends and family are hopeful that he will be found guilty of murder. However, the trial goes off the rails as the defendant plays the jury, the judge acts like he's working for the defense, and the victim gets blamed for her own death. And now, the verdict is in. Hello and welcome to The Dark Side of Love. I am your host, Bianca Sloan, author of suspense novels about the dark side of love. And this week I'm putting a spotlight on part 3 of the case I'm calling A Case of Murder. After a 6-week trial and 8 days of deliberation, the jury has finally handed down a verdict in the state of California versus Thomas Sweeney in regards to the killing of his ex-girlfriend, actress Dominique Dunne. When John was arrested, he confessed to strangling Dominique on Halloween Eve 1982 after she told him unequivocally that they were not getting back together. His defense is that she promised him they would get back together and then changed her mind, and that when she did that, he snapped and he lunged at her. Except he didn't actually remember strangling her, that he blacked out, and when he woke up, his hands were around her neck. Dominique spent 5 days on life support before she died. Initially, John, who at the time was a sous chef at the famed Ma Maison restaurant, was charged with first-degree murder, but his public defender, Michael Adelson, convinced the judge that his client was, quote, an ordinarily reasonable person who had strangled Dominique in the heat of passion after she spent weeks giving him false hope about their future. Instead, the jury was left to consider one of 2 lesser charges, either murder 2 or manslaughter. Further hobbling the prosecution's case was the judge, Burton S. Katz, not allowing the jury to hear, among other things, the testimony of John's ex-girlfriend, Lillian Pierce, who described numerous times when John beat her up, including breaking her nose, puncturing her eardrum, and throwing her down a flight of stairs. She had to be hospitalized twice. As far as the jury was told, John Sweeney was a poor lost puppy dog who had been mercilessly jerked around by his wealthy, successful, famous actress girlfriend, who was a raging cokehead, a falling down drunk, who thought she was better than him. In a nutshell, movie producer Charlie Wessler, who had known Dominique since she was a little girl, told TMZ Investigates about Judge Katz's rulings, quote, it seemed like a conspiracy to give him, meaning the defense, as much leeway as possible and make Dominique seem like she was an alcoholic slut. Quite honestly, Judge Katz is acting like he was a member of the defense team, or as jury foreman Paul Siegel aptly noted to TMZ Investigates, quote, the judge, he thought he was a celebrity. And when it was time for the jury to deliberate, they struggled with the judge's confusing 120-page instructions and how to determine the difference between manslaughter and murder 2. They asked the judge for help, but he just stuck his fingers in his ears and told them reading is fundamental and read it again. And then finally, after 8 days, they had a verdict. Dominique's father, the writer Dominique Dunne, wrote about his daughter's murder and the subsequent trial for Vanity Fair magazine, and he described the moment like this, quote, the jury entered, and the foreman, Paul Spiegel, delivered 2 envelopes to the bailiff to give to the judge. Katz opened first one envelope, then the other, milking his moment before the television camera like a starlet at the Golden Globes. Judge Katz handed the verdict to the court clerk, who read it out loud. John Sweeney was found guilty of voluntary manslaughter and misdemeanor assault. The maximum sentence for both combined was 6.5 years. However, between time served and good behavior, John could be released from jail after serving only 2.5 years. It is a stunning and unfathomable verdict. It's almost like he's being sentenced for stealing bubblegum. And okay, you probably get less for stealing bubblegum, but the point is that the punishment is not fitting the crime, not even close. Dominique Dunne had a bolt in her head to relieve the pressure from the swelling in her brain after John strangled her. But yeah, 2.5 years. The Dunne family is devastated. John Sweeney, after the verdict, he laid his head down on his attorney, Michael Adelson's shoulder in relief. And he and the Malmaison attorney, Joseph Shapiro, who had helped with John's defense, they are jumping up and down and fist bumping like they won the Super Bowl. They don't even have the decency to shut the hell up to show some decorum. Not demure, not mindful. And when the other member of the defense team, that would be Judge Katz, excused the jury, he encouraged them to have faith in their verdict, telling them, quote, "You were there. You saw the evidence. You heard the witnesses." And then because Judge Katz is Judge Katz, he rubs salt on the gaping wound that he helped to rip open with his bare hands by telling the jury that justice had been served and thanked them on behalf of the attorneys, the Sweenies, and the Dunnes. What cuckoo clock crack is this guy smoking? This was the proverbial straw for Dominic, who had endured weeks of Judge Katz mispronouncing his daughter's name, laying up to the jury, lavishing sympathy onto John Sweeney at every turn, tossing out testimony from witnesses, including the vital Lillian Pierce testimony, and he just snapped. He said in Vanity Fair, quote, "Rage heated my blood. I felt loathing for him. The weeks of sitting impassively through the travesty that we had witnessed finally took their toll." Dominic shouted out in court, "Not for our family, Judge Katz." According to Dominic, the judge looked shocked that he would say such a thing, or anything probably, and he told Dominic that he would have his say during the sentencing phase. But the well, it's just poison by that point, and Dominic said, too late by that time, and he took Ellen and he left the courtroom. Sentencing was set for November 10th. News of the verdict outraged everyone. People were, excuse my French, pissed. Beyond. There were protests outside the Santa Monica courthouse where the trial had been held. Local media was flooded with stories blasting the verdict while going in ugly, gory depth about John's history of violence towards women. Judge Katz got the worst at the backlash, rightfully so, and in a poll of prosecutors and criminal defense attorneys conducted by a local TV station, this strange thing, I guess that must be an LA thing, I've never heard of such a thing, but Judge Katz, he ranked as the fourth worst judge in Los Angeles County. As the sentencing date loomed, Dominic shared in Vanity Fair that the family had received word that Michael Adelson, who apparently is determined that John Sweeney is just not going to spend one single day in jail because he kept trying to make deals with the family before the trial had even started, but he said that he would cross-examine the family during their victim impact statements if they asked for the maximum sentence to be imposed. Well, sentencing day arrived, and two of John Sweeney's sisters pleaded for leniency, while his mother, Maura, described what it was like to be regularly beat up by her abusive ex-husband. Dominic and Ellen both spoke, and indeed, they did ask for the maximum sentence, refusing to bow down to Michael Adelson's threats, which turned out to be empty, as he didn't do any of what he said he would. And while there may not have been any shenanigans from Adelson, Judge Katz pulled some of his own. So, as I said, people were seething at the verdict. And in the time between the verdict and sentencing, the third member of John Sweeney's defense team had gotten so much bad press that right before he delivered the sentence, Judge Katz decided he needed to do some damage control, I guess, because he unleashed the most nonsensical tirade about the verdict. Hopped up on dangerously high levels of Johnny-come-lately righteous indignation, Judge Katz insisted, quote, "I will state on the record that I believe this is a murder. I believe that Sweeney is a murderer and not a manslaughterer. This is a killing with malice. This man held on to this young, vulnerable, beautiful, warm human being that had everything to live for with his hands. He had to have known that she was flailing to get oxygen, that the process of death was displacing the process of life. To John directly, he said, you knew of your capacity for uncontrolled violence. You knew you hurt Dominique badly with your hands and that you nearly choked her into unconsciousness on September 26th. You were in a rage because your fragile ego couldn't accept the final rejection." He saved most of his venom for the jury, saying, "The jury came back, I don't understand it for the life of me, with simple assault, thus taking away the sentencing parameters that I might have on a felony assault," going on to call the penalty that John would get, quote, "anemic and pathetically inadequate." Honestly, this is not a serious person. Attorney Paul Fitzgerald called BS on this grandstanding by Judge Katz, saying in the E! True Hollywood Story, quote, he was not one bit upset about this case. I think what had occurred is that he didn't realize the outrage that would come after the verdict. I thought it was an attempt on his part to mend fences, to smooth things over, to come back as a hero. You are not a hero, Burton Katz. Not even close. A disgusted Stephen Barshop, who prosecuted the case, said in the E! True Hollywood Story about Judge Katz, quote, he became the advocate for the prosecution's case after the fact. After the barn doors open, and after the fire has destroyed the barn, and after it didn't make any difference at all. Judge Katz's impassioned ranting is as jarring as it is pathetic. And in the end, John Sweeney got 6.5 years, cut down to 3.5. 3.5 years for a life. As Dominique's brother, actor Griffin Dunne, said to the Los Angeles Times, quote, I guess there never is any real satisfaction that the legal system can give, but this, the outcome, was such a blow, such a slap in the face to our family and to Dominique's memory. They literally got away with murder. The bitterness of that will never leave. The Dunne family even presented the court with a petition bearing over 1,800 signatures that said, we feel the verdict was a vindication of Sweeney's vicious crime. After the verdict, Judge Katz summoned the Dunnes to his chambers, and as Dominique described in Vanity Fair, he was, quote, utterly charming. He called us by our first names. He talked at length about the injustice of the verdict and his own shock over it, as if all of this were something in which he had played no part. He said his daughters had not spoken to him since the verdict came in. He ended the visit by giving the family his private phone numbers and telling them to call him anytime. Like, call him for what? They have less than zero use for this man. What does he think Dominique Dunne is going to call him up for a game of tennis and a round of martinis? Like, what is he on? Immediately after the verdict, Paul Spiegel, who was the jury foreman, was asked by a media outlet about whether or not hearing Lillian Pierce's testimony would have made a difference in the verdict, which of course nobody in the jury knew anything about her. And as Paul described it to E! True Hollywood Story, the light bulb clicked on that her testimony was what had been kept from the jury, that this was crucial evidence that they did not have during deliberations. Having now been clued in about the existence of Lillian Pierce, Paul told TMZ Investigates, quote, it would have made all the difference in the world. Fellow juror Mike Raymond echoed this sentiment to the E! True Hollywood Story, saying, quote, with that Lillian Pierce testimony, definitely would have found him guilty of second-degree murder. For Dominique's murder and the resulting farce of a trial and John Sweeney's tap on the wrist, killing his daughter, changed the entire trajectory of his life. He stated in several interviews that the experience was jarring, that it shook him up, but ultimately helped to usher in not just a new career, but a newfound purpose in life. With Quillette magazine noting that, quote, it was the death of his daughter that transformed him from pop fiction hack into a serious chronicler of his times. As Dominique told the Washington Post about witnessing the trial of his daughter's killer, quote, I had never attended a trial until I attended that one. That got me. I mean, I was so appalled at what I saw in that courtroom, how the rights of the defendant so exceed the rights of the victim, how so much about the defendant's past history is kept from the jury. But anything can be said about the dead person. It shocked me, and it horrified me, and it sort of changed the direction of my life. Writing would become Dominique's salvation, and he would go on to become a best-selling novelist, penning such blockbusters as The Two Mrs. Greenvilles, People Like Us, and A Season in Purgatory. But it would be his true crime reporting that would transform and invigorate him. For Vanity Fair, he covered some of the most sensational trials of modern times, including Klaus von Bülow, Michael Skakel, who was a Kennedy cousin, the William Kennedy Smith trial, speaking of Kennedys. And it was Dominique's coverage of the Menendez brothers trial that helped bring that particular trial into the zeitgeist. For anyone who watched Monsters, the Netflix show about the brothers, you know that Dominique's murder receives significant spotlight in episode 7. However, Dominique's legend was cemented with his stunningly in-depth and relentless coverage of the O.J. Simpson trial. He made no excuses for his coverage being far from objective, being keenly sympathetic towards the victims of these brutal crimes, with Quillette observing that, quote, the function of much of Dunne's work was to right a tragic wrong. And for Dominique, a continued wrong was John Sweeney's tragically ridiculous sentence. And in a misguided attempt to right that wrong, Dominique shared with Slate in 2007 that he tried to have John Sweeney taken out. He had hired LA private investigator Anthony Pellicano, known to be a Hollywood fixer, to track down John. He said that he just wanted to keep tabs on him and perhaps potentially warn any girlfriends about John's past. In reality, he wanted to put out a hit on John Sweeney and figured Anthony probably knew a guy. Anthony talked Dominique out of this idea, and Dominique said that eventually he just let it go, telling Slate, quote, I don't want to know where he is. It's much healthier. I just hope something terrible happens to him before he dies. It's not funny, I know, but it's kind of funny. It's kind of funny. Stephen Barshop, who had prosecuted the case, was bluntly quoted as saying about John, quote, he'll be out in time to cook someone a nice dinner and kill someone else. Well, he was half right. John served his sentence at Chino Correctional Facility, medium security facility in Chino, California. He was released in 1986 after serving only 3.5 years. He promptly landed an $80,000 a year gig as the head chef at the Chronicle, a swanky Erie in Santa Monica. When Justice for Homicide Victims, which is the advocacy group that Ellen, that's Dominique's mother, had founded, learned about this, they launched a campaign to get him fired. Standing outside the restaurant with flyers that read, "The food you will eat tonight was cooked by the hands that killed Dominique Dunne." Dominique's brother Griffin told the Los Angeles Times why the family felt so passionate about the campaign, saying, quote, this guy gets to be reinstated as the head chef in a restaurant as if nothing ever happened. I don't want people to think, hey, he killed someone, but I'll have the steak anyway. The negative attention forced John to quit the Chronicle, but Dew just kept landing on his feet, going on to become a chef at the Bellage in West Hollywood before he got fired when his bosses found out about his past. And finally, John Sweeney gave up and left L.A., first fleeing to the Pacific Northwest and eventually settling in Northern California. Shirley Wessler told TMZ Investigates that anytime John got a job, they followed him and got him fired from, quote, a good 7 places. As of 2025, John works as a general manager for a retirement community. Chef Michael Feig, who worked alongside John at Ma Maison, told the True Hollywood story that his former coworker had contacted him after he got out of prison and that the two went to a Dodgers game. And according to him, John claimed that he had, quote, found God while he was in prison. But did he? So, while John didn't murder anybody else, as Stephen Barshop predicted, his penchant for violence did not stop. So I guess he put God back wherever he'd found him. Dominique told The Telegraph in 2008 that in the mid-90s, he was contacted by a man who had read his Vanity Fair article at the trial and said he was worried because he thought his daughter might be engaged. Griffin and Dominique both, they got in touch with the woman and let her know that the two men, one and the same. She ended the engagement. John would go on to legally change his name from John Sweeney to John Mora, and TMZ Investigates uncovered a restraining order from the year 2000 against John by a woman who had a baby with him. Gosh. According to the petition for the restraining order, John dragged her through a hotel lobby by her hair, shoved her head into a bathtub, pushed her against a wall, and attempted to choke her. The woman took the baby and fled. And as TMZ Investigates reports, she never had any contact with John ever again after that. She was also too terrified to go on camera and share her story. Mike Raymond, the juror from John's trial, was shocked to hear about this incident, telling TMZ Investigates, quote, you would think he would have learned a lesson from the Dominique Dunne trial. Yeah, I think Mike Raymond is the only person surprised that he didn't learn his lesson. As Lillian Pierce herself said to TMZ Investigates about John, quote, he was a keg waiting to explode. Judge Katz got so much well-deserved smoke for how he handled the trial that he tried to backtrack on his crap rulings years later, telling the Los Angeles Times that some of his rulings were painful and that, quote, nothing is more difficult than rendering a decision based upon a law with which you disagree. Fortunately, following the letter of the law sometimes doesn't permit one to pursue the ultimate goal of justice. Judge Katz's judicial career eventually went down in flames. He was demoted to juvenile court before being kicked down to traffic. That's right. Burton Katz went from being a Superior Court judge appointed by then-Governor Jerry Brown, presiding over high-profile trials, to finishing his judicial career overseeing traffic tickets before he finally retired from the bench. And apparently, the man he had to thank for his career swirling down the drain was Dominique Dunne. Dominique took full credit and delight for Judge Katz's downfall, saying in the documentary Dominique Dunne after the party, quote, I ruined him, and I feel happy that I ruined his career. That was all me. I guess because Dominique Dunne knew a lot of people and, power of the pen and all that, but yeah, he was crying no tears for Judge Katz, nor should he have. And Ma Maison, what happened to Ma Maison? So the celebrated restaurant where John worked, famed for launching Wolfgang Puck's career, the eatery that was supposed to launch John Sweeney to bigger and better in the culinary world, crashed and burned in the wake of his trial and subsequent conviction. So after John was arrested, Patrick Terrell, who was the owner of Ma Maison, had told the Los Angeles Times that his sous chef was, quote, a very dependable young man, and that he would pay for John's legal fees. Now, John had a public defender, so he didn't get him a criminal defense attorney. But what Patrick did do was loan out Ma Maison's legal counsel, Joseph Shapiro, to the defense, and Shapiro was at the trial every single day. Patrick had insisted to the Los Angeles Times in 1988 that he did not hire an attorney for John Sweeney, but the optics of Shapiro, who's Ma Maison's legal counsel, everybody knows this, him being at the trial every day, those optics were out there in the world, so damage was done. And Ma Maison, back in the day, it was where the Hollywood elite would eat. And surprise, the Hollywood elite were alternately terrified by the prospect of eating food prepared by a murderous sous chef, and disgusted by the owner's support of said sous chef. Like I said, damage was done. Eater LA noted, quote, it is only fitting that a restaurant so storied come crashing down in headline-worthy demise. As many Ma Maison loyalists believe that because Terrell still supported Sweeney, the glamorous clientele that once frequented the restaurant began to peel away. Ma Maison, which had opened in 1973, closed its doors in 1985, 3 years after Dominique's murder. Ellen, Dominique's mother, became heavily involved in advocacy work around victims' rights, eventually founding Justice for Homicide Victims, heading up the organization until her health began to deteriorate. She retired to Arizona and died in 1997 at the age of 64. Griffin, it's Dominique's brother, the actor, he told The Guardian, quote, I will neither forgive nor forget about his sister or the travesty of John Sweeney's trial. He released his memoir, The Friday Afternoon Club, in 2024. And time has not necessarily healed the wounds, with the paper noting that Griffin's account of the murder and the trial burns with fury at the judge, the owner of Ma Maison, and actor David Packer, that's Dominique's co-star who was there that night but did not help Dominique. But Griffin points out, quote, I'm not going to let that be the A story of my sister's life. The last trial that Dominique Dunne covered for Vanity Fair was the murder trial of legendary music producer Phil Spector in 2008. Dominique Dunne died on August 26, 2009, at the age of 83. At the time of her murder, Dominique was filming what would go on to become one of the most iconic television miniseries of the 80s, the sci-fi classic V, as in Visitors. She had been cast as Robin Maxwell, and after her murder, actress Blair Tefkin was tapped to play the role. And apparently, I guess some of the scenes that Dominique filmed, they are still in the show, but it's things like the back of her head. But she still has a presence in the series. And the director, he dedicated the series to Dominique's memory. Dominique is buried in Westwood Village Memorial Park, coincidentally, the same cemetery as her Poltergeist co-star Heather O'Rourke, who died in 1988 at the age of 12 from congenital stenosis of the intestine after she went into cardiac arrest. Other notable figures resting here include Natalie Wood, who was close friends with Dominique's mother, Farrah Fawcett, and Marilyn Monroe. The marker on Dominique's grave says, "Loved by all." Dominique and Heather were 2 of 4 Poltergeist cast members to die under tragic circumstances, which has led some out there to claim that the movie is cursed. Julian Beck, who played the evil Preacher Cain in the second movie, had been diagnosed with stomach cancer and died shortly after filming. Will Sampson, probably best known as Chief in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, played a shaman in that second Poltergeist movie, and he died following a heart-lung transplant. Just as an aside, I can remember my stepmom and I going to see the second movie, Poltergeist 2, in like 1986. Maybe my brother was there. I don't know. But I definitely remember my stepmom and I going to see the movie. And so Dominique had played the oldest daughter in the original. And there wasn't any mention in the sequel about what happened to her. And my stepmom and I are like, well, what happened? How come they never said anything? Who left her character? Why didn't they bring her back? And this was obviously pre-social media, pre-internet, no Google. So it was years before I knew what had actually happened to Dominique. And honestly, it was probably the True Hollywood Story, because I used to watch that on repeat back in the day. And I was stunned to learn what had happened to her and how John Sweeney had essentially gotten away with murder. It's been over 40 years since John Thomas Sweeney murdered Dominique Dunne. The ridiculous trial and his subsequent disgraceful sentence still rankles, still stings, still burns, even after all this time. Deputy District Attorney Stephen Barshop, again, prosecuted the case. He told the True Hollywood Story in 1997, quote, "In 25 years now of being a prosecutor, I think back to this case as the worst trial that I had in 25 years. And jury foreman Paul Spiegel bluntly admitted to TMZ Investigates that Dominique did not get justice. He got it exactly right when he said, quote, "We got it wrong." They sure did. Thank you so much for joining me for another episode of The Dark Side of Love. I'm your host, Bianca Sloan, and show your love for The Dark Side of Love by visiting thedarksideoflove.com for show notes and transcripts. While you're there, sign up for my newsletter to be notified about new episodes. And you can also find a link to my Patreon page where you can access bonus material and other fun stuff. Learn more about my suspense novels about the dark side of love by visiting biancasloan.com. Thanks for hanging out with me, and join me next time for another tale of love gone wrong. I'll see you on the dark side.